Hello, everyone. Yeah. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our side event. I can see that some people still want to find a seat, I guess, and stay here, please. I know it's late in the evening. I'm happy to see all of you here to our side event. We are going to talk about the IP platform like many others have before this side event. And we're going to talk about it maybe a little bit more in a UNFCCC process point of view and from an Indigenous peoples point of view. So we're going to look at three things. What has been done since COP22? What has been the process and the thoughts? Why is the Indigenous Peoples Platform so important for Indigenous peoples? And where do we go from here? My name is Catherine Wessendorf. I work for the International Workgroup for Indigenous Affairs, IWGIA. We're an international NGO working on Indigenous Peoples' rights. We're based in Copenhagen. And this side event is organized by IWGIA together with the Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact, AIPP, a regional Indigenous peoples organization in Asia, and by NEFIN, Nepal Federation of Indigenous Nationalities, an indigenous national organization in Nepal. And I'm just going to introduce our speakers quickly. We have today Grace Balawak from Teptepa Foundation. Teptepa Foundation is an indigenous organization in the Philippines. And Grace has been the co-moderator of the multi-stakeholder dialogue in the SABSTA meeting in May this year. Then we have Larry Hegan, I hope I'm pronouncing it right, from the Government of Canada. He's from the Department of Environment and Climate Change. And Larry is also negotiating for the Government of Canada on the IP platform here in this COP. And we have Gerard Fremou from the Government of Belgium, who is representing the EU in the platform negotiations. Then we have Tunga Rai, who is from NEFIN, Nepal Federation of Indigenous Nationalities. And we have Rodion Suliansiga, who is from the Center for Support of Indigenous Peoples of the North from Russia. And we are waiting for a person all of you probably know. We don't have to introduce Hindou Oumarou Ibrahim, who is the co-chair of the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change. She will join us shortly. And with this, I would like to give the floor to our moderator of the event, who is Lakpa Nouri Sherpa, who is the Climate Change and Environment Program Coordinator of AIPP. Lakpa, you have the word.
Thank you very much, Catherine, for setting the background of the side event. Just to tell you, even though it looks like a very gender unbalanced panel here, as Catherine said, Hindou will be joining us in the panel, so it will be gender balanced. At least there will be 2 women representation in our panel, so it's not just men speaking in our side event. I'm very excited to moderate this side event because, as you can see, it consists of a fantastic set of speakers representing Indigenous peoples organizations and also the UNFCCC parties, so we can listen to the different ideas that we can relate to the local communities and Indigenous peoples platform. So as an observer organization or an Indigenous peoples organizations, engaging in the climate change process, we have always been hearing the term, this is a party-driven process. So that always limits the participation or the inputs of the observer organization in the climate change process. But in 2017, we have seen a number of new things that has taken place, especially in the context of Indigenous peoples. For example, this is the first time that Indigenous Peoples Day is being organized under the UNFCCC. So this is the first time that Indigenous peoples all over the world are coming together and having this kind of program within the UNFCCC. Furthermore, like Catherine said, it was the first time this year there was a multi-stakeholder dialogue, which was co-moderated by an Indigenous women, which is the Grace that representing all the Indigenous peoples around the world. So those are the new things that's coming up, even if it is a party-driven process, but there are things being explored in a way to make sure that parties can listen to, parties can interact to the Indigenous peoples organizations. So with that background, I would like to invite Grace to really take us to the process of this whole discussion on local communities and indigenous platform. When did it begin, and how are indigenous peoples actually participating in this whole process? Grace?
Okay, thank you very much, Lakpa, for that introduction for our side event. Yes, this is a very good panel with government representatives as well as indigenous peoples. I was asked to share on the background and developments of these local communities and indigenous peoples platform. So to start with, so that we will be all on the same page. The next slide, please. Yeah, of course, we started with what we achieved, partly what we achieved in the Paris process, or the agreement that we had. So in 2015, during COP21 in Paris, as you all know, there is a decision to establish a local communities and indigenous peoples platform. And we know that this is supposed to help us strengthen traditional knowledge, practices and innovations, and then at the same time to have a platform wherein we can exchange experiences and share our best practices on both climate change adaptation and mitigation in a holistic and integrated manner. Yeah, so a year later, COP22 called for submissions on the purpose, content, and structure of this platform, proposals for the purpose, content, and structure of this platform from the states and non-state actors. So indigenous peoples, non-government organizations, other constituencies like the women constituency, and states had submitted all their proposals on this, which was then collected, or which was then submitted last March 2017. And before all these submissions in February 27, we were very thankful that the EU had hosted an informal dialogue between state parties and indigenous peoples in Brussels, and to have an opportunity to exchange on ideas on the proposals, on the same thing, on the functions, objectives, and structure of this local communities and indigenous peoples platform. And so in the Substaff 46, the intersessional meetings in May 2017, there was a review of all of the submissions by the Secretariat, and at the same time there was a multi-stakeholder dialogue on the proposals in relation to the operationalization of the LCIP platform as called for by the COP21 presidency, or the COP21 decision. And this, as already mentioned by Lakpa, it was an innovative process within the UNFCCC wherein this multi-stakeholder dialogue was co-moderated by the Substat chair and a representative of the Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change, or the IPO constituency. Next. So, yeah, as a result of this multi-stakeholder dialogue, there is a report, an official report done by the UNFCCC Secretariat from all of the submissions and also the result of the multi-stakeholder dialogue. And this was posted in the UNFCCC website last August. And this will, the purpose of this is to inform further discussions on the operationalization of the LCIP platform. at this meeting now at Substa 47. And so we are now in this Substa 47 this November, and as you might have heard yesterday, one of the provisional agenda items that was presented yesterday and was then adopted yesterday is the agenda item number 13 in relation to the local communities and Indigenous Peoples Platform. Of course, the Substa 47 will be conducting negotiations for the next few days. The first negotiation will be done tomorrow at 10 o'clock on relation to this, and it is open to all constituencies, so we can participate, we can go and listen to the negotiations there or contact group discussions in relation to this. As we know, the Substa will be making recommendations in relation to this, the purpose, content, and structure of this local communities and Indigenous Peoples Platform, and whatever recommendations they will put forward will be decided by the COP 23. So we are looking forward into that, into this next 2 weeks. I think Larry and Gert will be discussing more on this, and I think that's it. I just have given you a very brief background and development on this. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Grace, for really giving an overview of the different steps of the development that has taken place since the platform was established by Paris decisions in 2015. And you also mentioned that there was a generous support from the government of Canada to actually host an informal dialogue between the state and parties, between the indigenous peoples and parties to really discuss on these matters before COP23. So now I would like to invite Larry Hagan to really share with us about the dialogue that took place in Canada, and also to really guide us in terms of the background that the two co-facilitators has already been selected for to lead the discussion on the local communities and Indigenous Peoples platform. So what would be very strategic for Indigenous peoples to make sure that our full and effective participation is ensured in the whole the contact group discussions of climate change of the platform discussion? Thank you.
Thank you, Lapka, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to come here to speak today, especially given that it is Indigenous Day and we're talking about the platform, and so it's very timely for me to come here today. Apologize if I'm a little tired or seem a little sleep deprived, because actually, Grace, the negotiation started yesterday, and that, of course, as people know, sets off a whole chain of what seems to be constant around-the-clock meetings and discussions. But it's been very good, and I'm really happy to be here. First, just by way of context, I want to say that Canada believes that the climate change policy and decision-making, both domestically and internationally, can benefit greatly from enhancing the engagement of Indigenous peoples and better understanding and integrating their traditional knowledge systems and their unique experiences into addressing climate change. This is something that we firmly believe in, and just domestically, in terms of our own sort of pan-Canadian framework on climate change, we have explicitly recognized there's an explicit commitment by the government of Canada to respect and promote and consider both, the views of Indigenous peoples, their role in helping to shape the implementation of our policy agenda on climate change domestically, and that reflects that, along with, I might add, every other party to the Paris Agreement, how we have agreed to respect, promote, and consider our respective obligations on the rights of Indigenous people when taking action to address climate change. So, yeah, internationally, it's certainly an immediate priority for Canada here at COP23 to seek a robust decision at the COP, and so that we can proceed in operationalizing the platform in a way that meaningfully engages the Indigenous peoples, enhances their, what I would say, their rightful voice in the UNFCCC. That's a starting point. That's something I think that's already been agreed to by parties, and that's why you're here today. Because as Grace mentioned, the parties have agreed to establish this platform. They've agreed on the need to strengthen the knowledge, experiences of Indigenous people engaging in climate action. Now it's time to operationalize the platform, and that is a prayer for Canada, and we're happy to be working with parties and Indigenous peoples here in COP towards that outcome. And I'm just saying I'm proud that Canada is actually we have 17 Indigenous representatives who are from Canada on our delegation to COP23, and this is the largest delegation of Indigenous representatives we brought to COP, and that reflects a large part the priority we have for having a meaningful decision that can proceed in operationalizing the platform. Now, this sort of, I would like to say, collaborative approach between the government and Indigenous peoples, it was reflected in the informal dialogue that we hosted in Ottawa on September 11th, 12th. In fact, it was Canada, i.e. the government of Canada, working in full partnership with 6 of our main national Indigenous organizations that fully planned the event, organized the event, and made it happen. The event, it was held under Chatham House rule, so I'm not going to disclose who said what, but it was attended by over 60 party and Indigenous representatives from around the world. It was, and I like to say it was successful in really building on the bond open multi-stakeholder dialogue that Grace outlined last May for advancing discussions on really sort of what are the option sets regarding specific functions and governing structures for the platform. Just a small note, I'd like to thank the IWGIA, Catherine. She was very instrumental in helping sort of provide us with support and making sure we had strong Indigenous representation from globally at our event. It was really very critical for us. In the spirit of what the platform is trying to achieve, which we think Canada is at the core of the platform, is it providing a space where parties and Indigenous peoples can come together for a dialogue where they're on equal terms and where Indigenous representatives are representing themselves and self-selected. In essence, we see the platform as not about Indigenous peoples, but it's a platform for Indigenous peoples. So that is sort of a key notion going forward. And I think that was sort of a key takeaway that both, I think came out of the dialogue in Bonn, but was reinforced at the informal dialogue in Ottawa. Just to get a bit more into the details of the discussion, I mean, so the context is important here, and participants in our dialogue noted that, we've already agreed to establish a platform, and that parties have already agreed on the need to mobilize stronger and more ambitious climate action by Indigenous peoples and local communities embodying a traditional lifestyle. This is something parties have agreed to. And so, in essence, the platform also represents an opportunity for the UNFCCC to develop its own tailor-made approach to enhancing the engagement of Indigenous peoples consistent with UNDRIP. And a lot of very rich conversation in the Ottawa dialogue centered around sort of the history of UNDRIP, the evolution of Indigenous rights under the broader UN system, and how that is important context for, in essence, recognizing parties' respective obligations to those rights under the UNFCCC. So I think that was important context, and from the perspective from parties, my perspective, it was really important to have that context. As a climate change negotiator, someone who spent sort of better part of my career doing climate policy, to understand the history of Indigenous rights and the history and experiences and knowledge of Indigenous peoples in Canada, that is something where, admittedly, from my perspective, party, I have to build up my own capacity to be able to appreciate. So having this dialogue today, dialogue that we're trying to achieve in the platform, is about building capacity. It's about building the capacity of Indigenous peoples, but also building the capacities of parties. And that was reaffirmed in our dialogue. A few other things that I'll note that was reaffirmed in our dialogue, that the dialogue, I'll just caveat, this dialogue wasn't a negotiation. It wasn't a negotiation. There was no negotiated outcome. There was no like, we agree on the following. But there was some sort of, I will say, areas where convergence could be seen to emerge. I've already talked about how convergence it's a space where Indigenous peoples and parties come together under equal status. Also, some convergence that the platform should be allowed to evolve over time. And I think that's an important context for the discussions this week, is that having the goal of launching the operational, that's a terrible word, launching the operations of the platform has to be done with a framework that, it's important to get it going, but it's also important to have a dialogue that allows the platform to sort of continue to develop over time. But at the same time, it should have clear time frames associated with its development. That was noted by the participants at the dialogue. It's about the exchange of knowledge, but within that mandate, it also is about the exchange of knowledge and experiences that helps to inform and influence climate policy, influence decision makers. Of course, we realize a platform needs resources and support, and that was duly noted. And that is something that, as parties, we will have to sort of come to terms on. And lastly, I'll note that when it came to traditional knowledge, it was noted that it's very important in the framework of the platform that the knowledge holder should have should maintain control over their knowledge. And I don't have to tell this crowd about the importance of that, and not least of all, it's enshrined in one of the rights within UNDRIP. So therefore, the platform, it was viewed as, it's not just a sort of place where knowledge is offered or taken. It's really where we can have a dialogue over, like, for example, what are the best practices and lessons learned, and how that knowledge is shared, and how traditional and local knowledge is shared to inform climate action. And so an emphasis on sharing best practices and lessons learned was a key theme of the discussion. So lastly, I'll just say for Canada, the September informal dialogue was critical for bringing the government and Canada and Indigenous peoples together to further consider our approach to the platform. So in essence, the platform's already been a success somewhat in Canada. It has brought government and our representatives of Indigenous peoples from Canada closer together in a sphere that frankly did not exist a couple of years ago. And so we are optimistic about having a successful outcome where that can be sort of done on a more institutional basis within the UNFCCC. And I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you, Larry, for that. Can we give a big round of applause? Yes. Thank you really for sharing the points that really come out as a convergence in the discussion in the Ottawa informal discussions, but also on explaining the domestic commitment and also the international commitment that you have for the participation of Indigenous people, really listening to the views what Indigenous peoples have to present in the context of climate change discussions. And I think this is really a good precedence that Canada has set by including 17 Indigenous peoples in their delegation, and this is, I think, the first time ever, maybe in the history of UNFCCC, where such a good number of Indigenous peoples delegations has been included within the party delegations. So we hope that the other party states under the UNFCCC will follow the path of Canada. So in the future we'll have more Indigenous peoples delegations together with the party delegations, so that our voice are always there whenever we discuss about the climate change discussions in overall. So thank you very much, Harry, for inspiring us, and keep inspiring us in the future. So. Talking about the platform discussion, I would like to go a bit back in 2015, where Indigenous peoples, the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change, were really fighting to have Indigenous peoples' rights in the Article 2. that was in Paris. We really fought very, very hard together with other civil society organizations to make sure that indigenous people's rights and human rights is there. But then in the end, the reference to indigenous people's rights and human rights was deleted from the overarching, that's the objective of the whole Paris Agreement. But then we managed to have indigenous people's rights in the preamble, and also the local communities and indigenous peoples platform is another very positive outcome that we can refer to for the Paris decisions. So, and then we have been engaging with EU since 2015, really to discuss about the indigenous people's rights, and GERD has been consistently following all the discussions also on the indigenous peoples and local communities platform. So it would be interesting to also listen to the views of EU on how can they really support the full and effective participation of indigenous peoples in COP23 and really come out with the good decisions that can help support the views and perspective of indigenous peoples in COP23.
Okay, thank you, and good afternoon to all of you. And some of you in the room might be hearing now for the 4th time in 3 days what I will have to say, so please bear with me, but some of you might not have heard it yet, so I will try to repeat a little bit. I just wanted to pick up on what you just said. It's true that the reference to human rights and the rights of indigenous peoples is not in the operative part of the text of the Paris Agreement, but it's the first time in history that there is a reference to human rights in a multilateral environmental treaty. So it is not to be subestimated what a big change this means. So yeah, I will just share some thoughts. Since Paris, as was explained by Grace, we are in a process that accelerated in Marrakesh. We're putting in place a formal process. And in parallel, there was an important informal process, I would say, where parties and indigenous peoples engaged in a dialogue. And I would say that to some extent, this dialogue we had over this year is somehow an example. We see this somehow as an example of what could be the role of this platform. In this approach of in this incremental approach, we see it as very important now to get the platform going, to operationalize it, and to also put in place a process and opportunities for its further review and development. As said, the context for this all is this preamble of the Paris Agreement and the decision of Paris that states that the rights of indigenous people should be respected in taking climate action. And to be more practical, we see the platform, a main role for the platform as being the interface between local communities and indigenous peoples organizations in the first place, then with parties under the UNFCCC and also with other relevant UN organizations and bodies. And its purpose should be to enhance the engagement of indigenous peoples under the UNFCCC and to exchange best practices and experiences. So it was already explained. I think there is an emerging consensus among parties that the 3 functions of the platform as set out in the report of this multi-stakeholder dialogue, being knowledge, climate change policies and actions, and also capacity building, that these are the 3 main functions that we kind of see for this platform. And therefore, we also need to put in place a minimal structure to make this happen. And in our view, this would be a continuation of this multi-stakeholders dialogues. Also, there would be a need for broader communication, and we see that there is a role there for a web platform or some web-based communication tool. And we also see that there is somehow a need to ensure the governments and some further thinking and organizing the work of the platform for a small group who can take this further. So yeah, and importantly, after some years, it would be important then to see what the platform has been able to do, how it can be improved, to assess the results, and then to see how it should further evolve in the future. Then finalizing my short introduction, I wanted still to add that we have also some important disclaimers that set some boundaries on what we see possible with regard to the platform, being that the way, and we had some, as also was already presented, we had quite again an unprecedented precedent for an innovative approach in having an indigenous peoples representative being co-moderator of the multi-stakeholder dialogue we held this year in May in Bonn. And we think we need to let's say, think out of the box and look for innovative solutions. But for us, it's very important that those innovative solutions don't infringe, don't violate the draft rules of procedure, which are applicable under the UNFCCC, and particular the party-driven nature of the UNFCCC. And this means also then that we don't see the platform as a negotiating body. I think that's important maybe to underline. But we see it, as I already explained, as a space to have a respectful and meaningful dialogue. And there, we need to see how this develops. But of course, there should be possibilities for the platform to inform the negotiations under the UNFCCC. But we don't see it as a negotiating body as such. I think these were like our general views on how the platform would look like, and we are very happy to be here and to be here in Bonn and to engage in this next steps, because it's as was pointed out, it's since yesterday that the negotiations after this more like exploratory phase are starting, and we hope that we can leave Bonn within 2 weeks with a meaningful decision on the operationalization of the local communities and indigenous peoples platform. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, maybe while I have the floor, I should apologize that I will have to leave a little bit earlier. Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing the views of EU and also expounding some of the things on relating to the platform. Yeah, we have been talking in the Indigenous Peoples Caucus also that we really need to have a decision that can actually continue or further the work on the operationalizations of the platform. So I would like to borrow the views that Kittisak expressed this morning. Let's help each other, let's work together, and we are really looking forward to work with the state parties and really coming out with a good decision that benefits not only indigenous peoples, but all the actors that are part of these climate conventions. So with that, now let's divert a bit of our discussions from this whole negotiations at the international level. Let's go to the different regions of the world and see and listen what indigenous peoples have to say about the knowledge holders in their respective regions. So for that, I would like to invite Tunga Rai, who is with the Nepal Federation of Indigenous Nationalities from Nepal, to share the experiences of Nepal. Tungaji.
Thank you very much. Having heard of international challenges, opportunities, and the collaboration we have come across, I really would like to share some of the realities that is in the ground. So how that knowledge, that indigenous knowledge and local realities can bridge the gaps that we have to overcome in order to overcome climate change crisis. So, okay. Lakpa already introduced me. My name is Tunga Rai. I work with Nepal Federation of Indigenous Nationalities, which is the umbrella organization of all the indigenous peoples organization in Nepal. And I grew up in the mountains of Nepal, and it's really of my own story or my own reality, at least, if not of mine, it's my neighbor's reality. So you can guess how that realities can really be reflected in the international policies and programs. So we win what we are doing right now for the future generation. So the title is Living in the kingdom of law. I say it's a kingdom of law because this is the ancestral land of the Loba indigenous peoples, one of the indigenous groups of Nepal. It is kingdom because it's governed by the traditional king and village chiefs of the indigenous peoples. And, you know, this village is in the rain shadow behind the Himalayas. And it's really cold, and it's a cold desert and arid and fragile landscape of the village. However, the people of this village are adapting to the climate change. You know, this village lies above 3,000 to 4,200 meters above the sea level, and the temperature is very, very cold. The temperature drops up to minus 10 degrees Celsius to minus 20 degrees Celsius in winter. In this kind of harsh and difficult situation at that village, indigenous peoples or indigenous knowledge do exist, and that indigenous knowledge has been very much helpful for the people to live in this sort of very difficult and very harsh environmental condition. So such indigenous knowledge has been part and parcel of the natural resource management, community governance, and that knowledge exists through the indigenous institution. For example, the Kemba system, which is a village chiefdom system of the village. So this kind of indigenous knowledge also exists in the form of festivals, and those festivals and knowledge of indigenous peoples affirm social, cultural, and environmental integrity at this village. So then, what is the importance of such indigenous knowledge which exists in this kind of communities? First of all, it plays a very vital role to manage natural resources, including irrigation system management in such a cold and arid land of Himalayas. And also it plays very important role for community governance and knowledge transfer from one generation to the other. This is the example how this kind of indigenous knowledge has been very helpful in order to overcome such climate change crisis. Look at this village. This is very arid and dry behind the Himalayas because of the rain shadow. However, the arid land has turned into green agricultural land because of the traditional knowledge of how to manage the irrigation in a scale level in their own way. So you can see the pipes that is installed to harvest water for the village. And then this arid land turns into such agricultural land in summer. You can see the canal, irrigation canal. So very precisely, let me give you the conclusion. Such indigenous knowledge of Loba indigenous people is one of the vital forces for them to live in such arid, high altitude, cold desert environment of the rain shadow behind huge Himalayas. And those indigenous knowledge contribute a lot to build climate change resilience at their level, at their village, and it serves the need of people and the government of Nepal, I would say. And those indigenous people are not just the victim, but they hold potential contribution to climate change solution. So now, my second last slide. So having had so many discussions about local communities and indigenous peoples platform, so how those knowledge that we hold in the communities can contribute to implementation of the Paris Agreement through the local communities and indigenous peoples platform. I see a lot of basis for that. First of all, the preamble of the Paris Agreement, which has a reference to the human rights and to the including the rights of indigenous peoples, and also the Article 7, which is about the adaptation, and paragraph 5 has a reference to traditional knowledge of indigenous knowledge. And there are so many provisions in Paris Agreement that really links with those realities and the discussion and the dialogue we are having about the platform. So, so just to come to the conclusion, I believe that at the international level, we bridge those gaps between the international dialogues and the local realities through the facilitative dialogues that we are aiming to have in 2018, and also the global stock take that we are anticipating in every 5 years. So that realities can be reflected in the NDCs of the countries and modalities and sources of information for the global stock take, and through the national communication. And very importantly, that also should be reflected at the national level. In the photo, you can see our National Planning Commission, where our realities should be reflected, and that realities should make a synergy to the international community through the NDCs of Nepal and through the climate change policies and the international obligations that is mandated by Paris Agreement and also other international agreements and treaties related to environment and related to the rights of indigenous peoples. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tungaji, for really sharing the experiences of Loba indigenous community and really expounding how the traditional knowledge is rooted in their natural resource management system and community governance. Just to share with you, the government of Nepal recognizes 59 indigenous peoples as indigenous nationalities, and Nepal Federation of Indigenous Nationalities have been really active in terms of bringing indigenous peoples to dialogue with the government on climate change and climate change adaptation and mitigation. So NEFIN has been really playing an instrumental role to facilitate the gap that exists between indigenous peoples and government. Thank you, Tungaji. Now we'll move to another region of the world, and I would like to briefly say something about the person that I'm going to invite, because he has played a very, very critical and very important role when we're in Paris, because that's the time where indigenous peoples from all over the world were very organized. We were there doing the side event inside the official venue. We were protesting inside the official venue. We were also in the indigenous pavilion, sharing our culture, showcasing our traditional food, and also trying to showcase all the cultural values that indigenous peoples carry all over the region. So Rodion has really played that leadership role during the COP23, and we can see the result in some of the very specific reference to indigenous peoples that came out from the Paris decision and also in the Paris Agreement. So with that, I would like to invite our previous co-chair of the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change, Rodion, to share about his perspective and also the Russia perspective and vision about Indigenous Peoples Platform. Rodion.
Thank you, Lakpa, for quite a good introduction. I hope I deserve this. And good afternoon. My name is Rodion Surenzga, and I represent the Russian region under the Indigenous Peoples Global Caucus. And it's so a pleasure to be here today and the Day of Solidarity with Indigenous Peoples. And also I would like to thank Canada for your leadership and to provide space and host a meeting to discuss in substantial way of the future of platform. I think that is a very strong step and move forward. And I also would like to thank the EU for your ongoing and permanent support towards indigenous peoples, not just within the UNFCCC, but also on global and UN level. And thanks, Catherine Nivgia, for your also innovative approach to bring us together jointly with parties, because I think it's a quite symbolic and a very relevant step how we can make a balance between all our different approach, even vision, but only this is a way how we can make a balanced decision at the end of the day. So, and I'm always trying to to be innovative, thinking globally but doing locally. It's a big gap still, because all decisions made by the United Nations at the global level, it's very hard to come to the local implementation. And all of us, we are here how to minimize this gap, how all kind of decision made at globe should be applicable and doable at the local level and will be helpful for people. Very briefly, I would like to talk about my region. It's a Russian Federation. It's the biggest country in the world. And, but of course, what is for us Siberia and Arctic, because we represent indigenous peoples of the Russian North, Siberian Far East. It's more than 4 different groups with total population 300,000. It's 0.2 of the total population of Russia. It means we are minority in our traditional land. And even for us, Arctic Siberia is our home, but for Russia, it's completely different approach, I should say. So it's basically economic drivers. It's storage of natural resources. So and we have to discuss with the Russian government, and we have to fight for our rights and lands, not just international but also domestically. But so far, we are facing with a lot of changes taking place in the Arctic, including Russian Arctic. Russia has the biggest Arctic zone in the world, and Russian economies continue based on natural resources exploitation, and Russia today is still promoting the Northern Sea route and still promoting international cooperation in the Arctic. So it means the role of the Russian Arctic, international Arctic, is growing. And it means the role of Russian indigenous peoples is also growing. And that's why we are quite actively internationally and being also today here. I don't know, yeah. It's, this is the current map of indigenous peoples location in Russia, one color, one people, and basically it's a very remote areas to the east of the Ural Mountains. So, and we covered 2/3 of the Russian whole territory, and not all of us. I mean, even in Russia, not all civil society are quite aware who are indigenous peoples of Russia. So it's a very multinational country with more than 190 different nationalities. So with different cultures, with different landscape, we are having tundra in the north, we are having mountains, we are having taiga and boreal forest, we are having deserts and steppe in the south. So it's completely different regions and different world in one country. So what are the key funding by many researchers, by many statistics, that we witness the rapid changes in the Arctic for all kind of sphere, including flora, fauna, infrastructure, permafrost, that of course negatively impact the population in the Arctic. And of course still a natural resources exploitation oriented economy of Russia, and the key issue for us is of course how to keep our land. So next slide, and I will short my presentation to save time and come to IP platform. Next one. And next. Yes. It's already mentioned a lot today and previous days that the key focus of IIPP platform and to provide and to strengthen and to respect the role of traditional knowledge and increase participation of indigenous peoples, to provide exchange space for sharing. And but my point today is that we are not limited working together only under the platform, because there are still many other critical issues like adaptation and mitigation, and we have to be put into the political agenda under the UNFCCC. So, and the other point is how platform and NDC should work together and should be integrated with indigenous peoples' fully involvement, and of course, again, how indigenous peoples should bring all this issue to the land rights as a core and fundamental rights for indigenous peoples. And my last point and conclusion, I would like to say that we should keep Africa warm, and also we should keep Arctic cold, because this is a global planetary balance for all of us, and this is our platform, how we can survive and how we can develop our own future. So, and also we have to keep our political negotiation within the UNFCCC as peoples. So that is a conclusion I would like to share with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rodion, for sharing the Russia perspective on the local communities and indigenous peoples platform. One of the interesting things that Rodion brought in his presentation is in relation to land rights, because we cannot isolate just talking climate change and human rights very separately. And I think climate change, I don't think I need to explain that climate change has become a human rights issue. And there are a number of colleagues I can see inside the room also really focusing on the human rights text inside this whole climate change discussions. So I would like to also briefly refer to what Kittisak said this morning when he was giving the opening session, opening intervention from Asia. There are a number of good practices that indigenous peoples are doing through the customary practices and governance system in different parts of Asia. But then there are also several challenges that communities are facing. For example, let's say deforestation, declaration of national park, different projects of mining, and also the consideration of mega dam as a clean energy that are actually evicting the communities from their territories. So there are a number of things that we need to consider when we talk about this whole climate discussion, and we don't isolate it from human rights. And that's the point that I think Rodion was really trying to connect between the climate change and human rights issue. And thank you, Rodion, again for that. Okay, now the next speaker, as I said in the beginning of this side event, that we have one more indigenous women speaker. And I feel very happy that I'm with this so energetic leaders. Like I said, in addition to Rodion, one of the key indigenous women leader that played a key role in really putting the whole indigenous peoples movement very strong in Paris, it's Hindou. And she's still continuing the good work that she has started in Paris, and that was continued in Morocco, and now in, again, yes, Fiji, but geographically in Bonn. So yeah, yes, Hindou, tell us what is the plan of International Indigenous Peoples Forum on climate change, and what are the different strategies that the Indigenous Peoples Caucus is making for COP23 to really have a very good decision for indigenous peoples?
Thank you very much, Lakpa, and good afternoon again. Sorry just to see me in this table all day. Thank you, Catherine, from IWGIA and AIPP to organize this site event. Is really important. And allowed me to thank Canada and Brussels or EU to be here in this panel. This is really one engagement that indigenous peoples here are looking for. So that's my first answer to LACPA questions. How we can be engaged, yes, not only at the negotiation, but also at the informal level where we can sit on the same side even and share our ideas. So that we are looking for it, I think we are going to achieve it. So that said, as International Indigenous People Forum on Climate Change, the 7 regions meet and gather since Paris through Marrakesh to see how we are going to operationalize the Indigenous Peoples Knowledge Platform. And this is the big discussion and organizational way that we are having. What we are expecting is how the state parties who are going to sit in the tables and negotiate in our behalf can reflect what we need. So then I tell you what we need. Of course, we have the first contact group where you allow us to be in the room with you and then discuss with you, at the end give you our just views. So that's one of the steps we are looking for, how we can have our full and effective participation at the decision making. This is the first process. We sit in the table and we understand the position of Canada and EU who are with us here, that it's a state driving process under the UNFCCC. Of course, it's a state drive process. But let me tell you, who are these states? They are a human being like the indigenous people who are human beings. Who put the laws and the rules under the UNFCCC? It's a man. So man wrote these rules. A man can change these rules. Like it's not written in stone that it cannot be changed. So why I'm saying that we wrote it and we can change it? Because climate change is changing. If climate change is something also like a stone who do not move, of course we can just stay with the rules who cannot moving, and that can be work. But suddenly, the climate change is something who's moving and changing every day for the worse, not for the better. And for the worse, like we need to change our rules and procedures to really implement it better. So indigenous peoples expecting that our full and effective participations in this negotiation on a platform of knowledge sharing to respect the rights and to be flexible, adapt to the rules and change these rules. When you give us the floor to co-chair with the substate chair, it was your decisions during the COP, but it affects us all positively. We chair it, and then we feel included, and then our elders back home feel included. So that's the reflection we wanted to give. So we wanted to be in the table with you and give you our ideas. You can take it, or you can just say, no, this is not working, because we want to learn from you also. We are not dictating to you, but we want to learn. Then in order to have the same balance and sharing, so we need to sit in the same tables. The second thing that we want is the knowledge who is the best of all. So in those knowledges, how we are going to put them in the table, how we are sharing it. So our knowledge are not oral. Our knowledge are practical. And the practice is linked with our land, territories, and natural resources from our 7 regions, but also from our countries, from our local places. So how we can have that? Having just like a meeting at the international level is very relevant, very important. But how we can link that to the regions, how we can link that to the national level. So when we say regional and national, we have the state parties who have a NAPS document, a NAPA document, a NAMA document, a RED documents, plan, program, project. So in all those, how the indigenous people's knowledge can be reflected to be implemented for the peoples who need those knowledges to get adapt. So this is very important for us to see it. And in order to do so, like we ask for like a structure, a mechanism who can allow us to be with you. It can be called open-ended working group. It can be called, facilitative, or, I don't know, indigenous people group, or you can give whatever name that you want. But for us, the most important, how this mechanism can be representative from government side and from 7 regions of indigenous peoples. Because we don't want to have the process where it's only indigenous peoples who can be there and discuss outside. We have this one, thank you. We created ourselves. But we want one who can have you as country and who can have us. And this mechanism need, of course, like a structure. It can be a co-facilitators, co-chairs, or I don't know, whatever word that international system have, but we want these peoples to be also equitable, at least. 2 indigenous peoples, 2 can come from you. Or you have 3, and we can have 3, and that can make balance. What people asking, indigenous or non-indigenous? Justice. And if we want to have justice, we need balance. And when we have this balance, I think everything can be resolved. Finally, what we are expecting needed is funding. Because we know everything cannot work, all what we said, all this capacity, without funding. So we need the capacity building to build our capacity, but we need also to build the capacity of the state. And we need the funding. So we need a volunteers country. And that I really thanks sincerely Brussels and in the person of Gert here. Then I thank Canada in all the many people who discuss with us. I cannot cite all the names. Who had organized for us like the informal discussions. So we need those countries to champion, put like a voluntary funding for indigenous peoples to allow it as participate, because we are not coming from the state. We do not have focal point at the UNFCCC to get funding, and we are sure that we are attending COP every year or attending intersession every year. We don't have that. We are struggling really. And then how this funding can help indigenous peoples to attend properly to the UNFCCC negotiation, but to the other international process related to it. And how this funding can help the project and program of indigenous people to get implemented at the local level, at the national level, at the regional level. How we can create this funding to help us exchange knowledge. I'm a pastoralist from Chad, I'm Bororo, but I have many things to exchange with a Sami who have eyes in them land, but who are also a pastoralist moving. I have a lot of knowledge to share with my brother here from, Rodion, from Siberia, who have also the same life. Of course, we have also the 3 forests who are in the different regions. We have the knowledge to share in terms of sustainability. So we need the funding to help us to doing that. Final, what we need a decision who can come out from this COP. We know that it's going to be a decision, but we don't want to have any decision because we want a decision. We want a decision who can help us to fulfill what we are expecting. And this is the first step. Of course, countries have by 2020, they meet a target, 2030. So as indigenous people, if we have this decision now, and we can set up together with all of you here, how we are going to implement it, and then we put the target by 2020, we put the target by 2030, and then let the future tell us, we will measure out the indigenous people's knowledge will help on the sustainable solution, and we will see the impact in our land, in our peoples also. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hindou. Very, very passionate sharing and intervention from the Indigenous women leader of the Indigenous Peoples Caucus. And yes, thank you very much for also really expounding, elaboratively explaining like what are the demands of Indigenous peoples and why they are here. And I would like to connect the message that you said. We are not here just to participate. We are here to be heard. And that's the message that the UNFCCC Secretary Patricia shared this morning in the opening. we want indigenous peoples to be heard when we are discussing about these local communities and indigenous peoples platform. So we are going in the right directions, and I think we need support of each and every states here, and also support of all the actors that are present in the room and present in COP23 to really go ahead and have a decision, not just a decision like Hindou said, a good decision that can actually further continue the work of the indigenous peoples and local communities platform. Okay, we have completed the sharing from all the panelists, and we only have 15 minutes. Sorry for that, because we have a number of speakers in our side event. So I would like to open the floor for questions and clarifications. Please introduce yourself and direct whom you are asking the questions to.
Okay, sorry. Mini, and I would like to ask a direct question to the EU. We've heard this, and I've tried very hard to think about it since Friday. What is meant by incremental approach? It's such a difficult word, but also we would like to get a clearer, maybe you've also slept over it, and maybe you have a better idea on what is incremental, what are the elements that we would like to see in this incremental approach, and maybe you can expound more on what you mean by it. Thank you.
One more here, a brother.
Yeah, I'm Mamadou Mbodj from Senegal. My question is directed to Hindou. Your passion is ça m'émerveille. I don't know if to say that in good English. My question is to you. This organization about indigenous people, this is the first time I really heard about it. I'm lucky enough to have attended this workshop to see what's going on around that. What have you already achieved in Africa? Because I've been visiting some minority groups in the east of my country, the Bedik and the Bassari. I know them very well. Are you in touch with them? And if not, go ahead and try and connect all these people around first before going to the world. So I'm really amazed about what I've heard this tonight.
Can we have two more so that Gideon?
Thank you so much. We appreciate support from the European Union together with Canada. And we know both of you are the champion of indigenous people rights in climate change as far as the indigenous people and local communities platform concerned. Now my question is, how can you assist us or support us, especially or particularly African countries, to ensure that you bring them on board to support this platform? Because indigenous people are not recognized and their rights are not respected in Africa, leave alone the platform. So how can you bring these countries who are not recognizing or respecting the indigenous people rights on board to support this initiative? Thank you.
Can we have one more? Anyone? Okay, so we will get the response, and then we'll open the floor for second round of questions and answer. So the minis questions.
Yes, thank you, and thank you for the questions, and I will try to explain a little bit. Yeah, actually, incremental approach is just a difficult wording for a step-by-step approach. You know that we used to use difficult terminologies in this process. And why we think that is needed, and actually I think Marrakesh already showed that this was needed, because I think it was not, you might share my views or not, but I don't think, and let's say I hope almost, that I don't think it was possible, or let me still put it differently, I think the chances to achieve let's say a meaningful operationalization of the platform in Marrakesh were much smaller than they are now. And I think that is thanks to this like process of discussion that we started to have with you and with other parties. Like let's before jumping to putting in place something that might not be attending our expectations, let's discuss among each other, let's think good, and let's try to convince others who are maybe a little bit hesitant. So that's I think like what is in our mind when we talk about an incremental approach. So there are some other reasons or related reasons. In this process, it is just difficult to make big changes. If you look at other work streams, many things are look at the Paris Agreement. First we had Copenhagen. It didn't really work out as we wished, and then we tried again, and we achieved the Paris Agreement. And so there are many other examples. So that's one thing, and another important. There are two other aspects. One is, I also referred to this already. It's also about learning by doing. I think we will have to learn to have this dialogue with each other. There are many challenges. I didn't elaborate on the challenges, but even with the best will, I think it's quite challenging I see two big challenges to discuss and to create added value at the global level for, as was pointed out in the presentations of the two indigenous colleagues, for problems that are to a large extent local and need to be addressed locally. This doesn't mean that there is no role for the global level, but it's quite challenging, and there are some interesting experiences we know, but it's in any case we think that's quite a challenge. And another challenge is also and it's also, I think, a process learning by doing. There are some interesting experiences in IPBS. IPCC is starting to do this, but how we organize a dialogue between science and traditional knowledge, so to speak, because those are two knowledge systems who have their own logic, and we can see that they can be complementary, that there can be synergies, but it's not easy to make it happen. So it will also be like learning by doing. And then the third reason, and was raised by and trying, and maybe not, I will respond to the question in a second time. But and the third reason is that there are many countries, as you know, that are very, very reluctant and hesitant, and so they might come on board, let's say, in an approach that is not too ambitious from the outset, I would say. But then we need to build this trust and then again make other steps. And what we can do for, I mean, we Canada as well, and we as well, we are talking to other countries, but we are well aware that there are countries who have, let's say, a difficult relationship with their indigenous peoples. And again, this is mainly an issue that needs to be solved at the national and the local level. I guess we can, I mean, we can talk to them, but this is not, you don't solve this with having a conversation, I would say, and I don't need to explain this to you, of course. So yeah, that was just a couple of elements of answer.
Hindou, you'd like to respond?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, as you said, in Africa, we did some. Oh my God, climate is changing in this room. It's becoming more cold than now. So what we did, actually in Africa, we have several networks. We have one called Indigenous Peoples African Coordinating Committee, who have more than 135 organizations present in 24 countries in Africa. And we had also PIDO, who is in all East African regions. And then we had like many other indigenous peoples network. And then we have many indigenous peoples organizations at the national level. So let me give you one example. We have Repaliac, who is the Le Réseau des Peuples Autochtones de l'Afrique Centrale. It's a network of indigenous people of Central Africa. In 2013 and 14, so we had organized a indigenous peoples gathering. we call it FIPAC, like International Indigenous People Forum of Central Africa. And then we had head of state who attended. We had President Deby from Chad, of course, from my country. And then we had the President Sassou Nguesso, and we had President Yayi Boni. So 3 heads of state, they come to the indigenous people's land in Congo Republic, very far in the forest, like 700 kilometers from Brazzaville. So they come there, and then they initiate any space. They dedicate a big space, call it Indigenous People Village, for traditional knowledge. So they recognize this institution officially under the CSA. And these institutions, it's launched by head of state, and then officially working to implement the indigenous people's traditional knowledge through all the green economic of the 11 countries of Central African region. And all of them are part of COMIFAC, who is the Commission of Basin of Congo. So that's the things when we achieve, like the very big one. I mean, never happened around the world, but we get it in Africa. So we achieve also many other small activities through the 3D participatory mapping, through the knowledge, data monitoring, through exchange between regions. So we have several initiatives already working there. But of course, we cannot say they are perfect, because most of them are not linked yet with the Paris Agreement. But the good news is all the countries ratify the Paris Agreement. And now it's going to be like an obligation to implement it, because the Article 7.5 of the Paris Agreement enumerated clearly that indigenous people's traditional knowledge is part of the solution for adaptation. And then we have the Decision 135 on the Indigenous People's Knowledge Platform. So it's a process in Africa, but as you said, we're really willing to have all the communities as indigenous peoples or local communities who have the knowledge to share and who suppose also to benefit from it, to come together and do it. And you are the brother from Africa, so please just disseminate the message, sorry, and let us work together to make it happen in our region. But don't forget, we are 7 regions of indigenous peoples, and that's the biggest thing we have together, because we have one planet, so we do not discriminate any of our region. We work all together to achieve the climate change. Thank you.
Thank you, Hindou. So Brother Dan and Stanley.
Thank you, Lakpa, and thank you, panelists. My name is Daniel. I come from Kenya. I really want to appreciate, of course, the EU and Canada for taking the leadership in supporting the indigenous peoples in this process of the platform. And we hope that this is just the beginning of the journey, or somewhere within the journey, that we still have a long way to go. And I have just like 2 very short points that I thought we needed. I would need to request our friend from the EU to just clarify. And it's about reconciling what you said, that the platform is basically will need to really work outside the box for us to be able to achieve what we think we need to do with the platform. While at the same time, you mentioned that we need to work within the UNFCCC process. I don't know whether that is any contradiction in any way, because sometimes it will need, for example, the decision that was done in Marrakesh to have a co-chairing or a co-moderating within the substa to have a good consultation. And the other example is what Canada did, was to provide this opportunity outside the UNFCCC process to provide for good consultation, where feedback can actually be provided to the process. So I don't know whether that, if we stick within the UNFCCC process, of course, understanding that it's a party-led process, but yet this is a platform that you specifically also say it is for indigenous peoples. So a bit of explanation on whether that is any contradiction or whether that will keep this process on a loop, that will, on a vicious cycle that will never be able to get us to what we hope to get. The other one is also on around one of the objectives of the platform, which is a place for dialogue. But at the same time, you mentioned that, you said that this is not going to be a place for negotiation. It's not a negotiation body. And knowing that policy changes and policy advocacy is within the realm of negotiation. So whether, so those two seem to be quite contradictory, and I just needed to probably hear a bit of explanation from your side. Thank you.
Stanley.
Thank you again, the panelists, brothers and sisters from the experiences, and the distinguished delegates from Canada and the EU, who have really put their energy and thought and their time and resources in Brussels and in Ottawa. You've worked with us this far. We have faith that you will work with us till wherever destination we are going with the platform. So my question relates again to the incremental approach, and sorry for coming back to it. I think it is useful to hear the challenges that Kurt mentions about learning by doing, bringing other parties that are little, that need to be engaged to come on board, and letting experience inform the next stages. But I think the challenge of an incremental approach as it is now, we don't know where we are going and when we'll ever get there. And so how about a roadmap? Of course, we know the text talks about an incremental approach. How about instead of incremental, we talk about a roadmap which has some milestones that we need to deliver and review then when we have reached or adjust where necessary if we haven't realized. Because the challenge as it is, there is no push for us to deliver because there are no timelines. And so my question really is there a way that this can be a little articulated and nuanced to be a roadmap with milestones deliverable within the UNFCCC framework of intersessionals and COPs? Thank you.
Thank you, Stanley. To respond?
Yes, thank you, and thank you again for the questions. Yeah, on the first question, outside the box, inside the box, inside the UNFCCC, outside the UNFCCC, let me respond. Yeah, I think that's indeed. I mean, it's like playing with words, but it's a very relevant question, and I would like to say that the innovative solution that we found to let an indigenous representative co-moderate the multi-stakeholder dialogue doesn't violate the UNFCCC rules of procedure, because otherwise it wouldn't have happened. And so this was an example of like a way we tried to accommodate a request which we knew was very, very important for the indigenous peoples organizations into the context of the rules of procedure, or in accordance with the rules of procedure. And I can assure you that the lawyers of the UNFCCC Secretariat, they spent quite some time in verifying, in looking this up, in trying to put the right wording in place. So I would say this is an example of something that is both in line with something you are looking for and does not violate the rules of procedures. And we think that's the type of solution we need to look for. And therefore also, again, if we are looking for a space where we can have this dialogue, an open dialogue, and where there, where we can speak to each other in an open and meaningful way, then, in our view, it is not as such in the UNFCCC, because the UNFCCC, it is, I mean, that's not the right way of putting it, but the negotiations will always be party-driven, to put it simply. That's what we are convinced of, and certainly at this point in time, there will be no support for changing this in a very radical manner. You might know that this draft rules of procedure, they are in place since the beginning of the UNFCCC, I think, and they are still draft because they are so sensitive, and there is still an article that is kind of pending, and therefore they continue to be the draft rules. Then on the incremental approach, again, well, maybe just trying to clarify that we want to see a milestone here at COP23, as far as we are concerned. So it is not like, let's go on talking and talking and talking. No, so we had a first round of a first year, and we put in place a date, being COP23, to operationalize, and that's where we are looking for. And as I mentioned, we also are proposing to have, after some years, a review. And we think it's difficult now to predict what this just will entail, because we need to see how things go before we can do that, basically. But so I don't know whether this is a satisfying response, but this is how we see it. Thank you.
Thank you. Good. You would like to respond briefly to this incremental approach?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the question. Yes, I think this incremental approach is a key issue, and I support what Geert had mentioned in terms of an incremental approach is an ability, the platform, to sort of develop over time, be able to learn what works, what hasn't worked, and to build that into sort of the evolution of the platform over time. And so whether it's incremental approach, phased approach, I think there's a recognition that the first major milestone, I totally agree with the EU and others, is to get the platform operational so that we can start to sort of launch this process of learning by doing. I think another key aspect from Canada's perspective is that there, as part of this dialogue that can happen freely between parties and Indigenous peoples, doesn't sort of end up being then overruled by just a discussion amongst just parties. And so I do support what the EU says, is that for Canada, that means it's, inside, outside the box. It isn't a sort of, it can't be just part of a formal negotiation process. I don't think that would serve the purpose of what the mandate that was agreed to in Paris. In terms of a roadmap, that's an interesting concept. I think the way sort of Canada has been thinking of it is that as part of the dialogue between parties and Indigenous peoples, that can happen, that can include a dialogue on what is the sort of way forward for the platform. So I don't think, as part of the negotiations in this week in COP, that you want to get into a detailed roadmap, because the negotiations right now are part of this party-driven process. And that and that is something that we will not, unfortunately, be changed where we are today or in this week in COP. So I mean, definitely the way forward for the platform can be part of the dialogue that I outlined as part of the core of the platform going forward. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is the kind of interaction that we really wanted to have with Indigenous peoples and states, and that's also the reason why we have like a very balanced panelist representing Indigenous peoples and the parties. So there was a very good exchange of informations and interactions, and I think it was a very good sharing of experiences, plus sharing different ideas and views, how we can engage more constructively. We are running out of time. We have a closing sessions of the Indigenous Peoples Day. So before I conclude, I would like to borrow the words of Larry, saying that the local communities and Indigenous Peoples platform, it's not about Indigenous peoples. It's for Indigenous peoples, and we need to continue this constructive dialogue and interactions tomorrow, day after tomorrow, until the end of this COP23, so that we can really come out with a very constructive decision that is beneficial not only for Indigenous peoples, but for everyone. So let's work together. Let's continue this positive energy and spirit of working together. Thank you very much, everyone. And let's give a big round of applause for all our panelists for a very wonderful sharing. Thank you very much.